We're going. Thank you. Okay, thanks for joining us, folks. A small but engaged and interested group. So thank you so much for coming to the U.S. Center. My name is Ashley Allen. I work for the U.S. State Department's Climate Change Office. And why don't we go ahead and fill in up here? Don't be shy. Come on in up to the front seats. That way we can have a more engaging conversation. Thanks so much. Perfect. Thanks for joining us. The U.S. Center, if this is your first time joining us, this is our 7th year supporting the U.S. Center with the idea that it's our public outreach and diplomacy space where we reach people all over the world with climate data, climate science, and the latest actions in the U.S. on climate change. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you also to our online audience for joining us all over the world. Be sure to hashtag AskUSCenter when you have a question. We'll follow you on Twitter and we'll share your question with our panelists. Speaking of our panelists, I'm happy to introduce the event today, which is hosted by the U.S. Council for International Business, and the event is called Deploying Innovative Technologies for Climate Change, Looking to Trade to Jumpstart Paris Action. To kick off the panel and introduce the rest of the panelists, I'm pleased to introduce Noreen Kennedy, who is with the U.S. Council for International Business, and she is the Vice President for Environment, Energy, and Strategic International Engagement. Noreen.
All right, thank you, Ashley, for that great introduction, and thank you to the U.S. Center for hosting us here. Welcome, everyone, and I'm thrilled to be here. I've lost track of how many presentations we've done at the U.S. Center as USCIB, but we always find them terrific events, and it's great to be hosted here by the U.S. Center. So the title of our event today is Deploying Innovative Technologies for Climate Change, Looking to Trade to Jumpstart Paris Action, which we're all very interested in. But while you know that there are 40,000 of us gathered in Paris for COP-21, you might not all know that in Geneva, the Environmental Goods Agreement is holding a round of negotiations. And so I can kind of imagine a parallel world in which somewhere in Geneva, in the margins of the Environmental Goods Agreement negotiations this week, someone is about to do a side event on looking to climate change to jumpstart action on trade. And I can even imagine a World Trade Organization hyperwall showing the flows of goods and services in all kinds of great colors and graphics in the same way that the NASA hyperwall has been showing us some wonderful things over the course of the day. So there are several side events on this topic of trade and climate change over the next 2 weeks in COP21, including a slate of excellent events from the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, but I'm very glad that USCIB is kind of first in line, as the ICTSD team is a very tough act to follow. But anyway, I think the number of side events that we're seeing here on trade and climate change are a very clear indication of the potential for synergy. And I'd even go further than that and say that it's not just potential, but really the imperative for a mutually beneficial relation between trade and environment. And that synergy is well worth getting right. And we believe very strongly in it in the US business community. And I would further say that as much attention as carbon markets and carbon pricing are receiving as kind of the expected and ubiquitous message from the private sector on climate change, I'd like to offer another one here. Because as important as those are, even more fundamental to us in many ways is this, that US business believes we must get cleaner technologies of all sorts widely deployed, and trade is the best way to do this. So now I'm going to provide a very brief and painless intro PowerPoint from my side, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So, whoops. USCIB was founded in 1945, the United States Council for International Business. We are a unique US business group in that we cover international policy, representing US business in multilateral forums like the United Nations. We promote open markets, competitiveness, and innovation, as well as sustainable development and corporate responsibility for and by the US business community. We're multi-sectoral, so we represent large multinational companies of all kinds, and we have a membership of some 300 associations, businesses, and law firms. I don't know if you can read this slide. We had to squish it a little bit, but this is showing the affiliations that USCIB maintains with large international business groups, which are our entry points into the UN system and on international policy. We're the US affiliate of the International Chamber of Commerce. We represent US employers in the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and then we also represent US business in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And last but definitely not least, when we're talking about climate change, we are one of the US business partners in the Major Economies Business Forum on Energy, Security, and Climate Change, which has been very active on trade and climate issues. Here is a very brief CV of our work on both the topics that we're going to be talking about today. On climate change, USCIB has been representing US companies in the UNFCCC since before COP, since 1993. And our focus has been mainly on climate and issues, climate and investment, and climate and trade, as well as a focus on engaging business in these deliberations and in offering value to the governments and to the Secretariat as we move forward in climate action. Then on trade, we have a very long resume, which I've summarized very shortly here. We represent US companies in a number of trade agreements, including the World Trade Organization and the Environmental Goods Agreement. We are a member of the Coalition on Green Trade, and we strongly support the Environmental Goods Agreement. So we do have a lot of experience in both arenas, and we don't see them as functioning in silos. We do see them as working together. So I'm just going to close with some opening observations, and then I'm going to introduce all of our panelists at once. So where do we start in this discussion? First of all, we feel that innovation and technology has to be promoted across the entire life cycle of technology and commercialization and deployment. So it's not something that happens just at one stage of the game. It's a very complicated picture, and everything has to work together. We're looking at trade as providing carrots rather than sticks. We're looking to avoid trade tensions and trade distortions and tariffs. We're looking for ways to incent trade in cleaner technologies, and we see the Environmental Goods Agreement and other supportive trade frameworks as helping to do that. We're seeking an integrated system that works with the dynamics of the global market, that synergizes with UN technology forums, not least of which is the Technology Mechanism and the CTCN, which we'll hear about in a minute, that mobilizes private sector innovation, that encourages partnerships, including some of the existing partnerships that are moving forward through the Technology Mechanism, and that recognizes working relationships both with public, private, and multi-stakeholder collaborations. So I guess the last point I'll make, which is a kind of a disclaimer, we know that neither the UN Framework Convention nor the Environmental Goods Agreement and the broader World Trade System is perfect or finished. They're both evolving, they're both changing to meet new circumstances and new objectives of the business community and of the governments. So as they both are moving forward, we need to align and find ways to scale up those synergies and build in flexibility to new circumstances and technologies. So with that, I just want to show that we have a couple of websites that pertain to this, and we encourage you to look at these. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and we have a very august group. Our first speaker will be Dr. Brian Flannery, who's a Center Fellow at Resources for the Future. He's had a very long involvement in the international climate and energy arena. He currently serves as the chair of the Business Engagement Task Force of the Major Economies Business Forum and the Green Economies Dialogue Project. He's co-author of the widely used reference Numerical Recipes, The Art of Scientific Computing. He recently retired from ExxonMobil as Science, Strategy, and Programs Manager. Our next speaker will be Jukka Uusakainen. So Jukka is a reformed climate change negotiator from Finland and a longtime champion of effective technology cooperation. He was appointed as the director of the CTCN in 2014. And he has been a very good partner in trying to look for ways that the UN system can actually synergize with global markets and get innovative technologies out there. And for those of you that don't know, the CTCN is the operational arm of the UN Framework Convention Technology Mechanism, hosted by UNEP and UNIDO, with 11 independent regional organizations. Our last speaker is Henry Derwent, who's Senior Advisor of Climate Strategies. Many of you know him. He was CEO of AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association, for 5 years, and he remains an honorary vice president there. He is also involved in ICTSD's E15 initiative, which is bringing forward new insight and innovative ways to avoid trade and environment conflicts. So these are our panelists. We are expecting one more, who I will introduce if he joins us, but he's currently in the negotiations, Kuni Shimada. So with that, I am going to ask Brian to take the floor. Thank you.
So thank you to USCIB and thank you to the US Center for the opportunity to participate in this process. Closer. Thanks. So I'm going to be talking about trade and transformational change. A lot of the discussions are still rooted in the days of Kyoto, which were about politically feasible targets for a subset of nations, but we're now talking about transformational change to a zero-carbon society. And we need to think strategically about how that will come about in the context of trade and other processes that we deal with internationally. So that's going to be my grounding point. So I want to look at climate, the 2013 development agenda, and trade. It's very clear that achieving the ambitious objectives in climate and green growth will require transformational change through rapidly accelerated development and deployment of advanced technology systems, many of them currently non-commercial or politically challenged, so it's going to be a big lift. Deployment to a low-carbon society will occur globally in thousands of individually multi-billion-dollar investment projects, as well as a host of lower-cost, more incremental projects. But this is a vast enterprise. The IEA, the IPCC, and others have estimated that in energy supply and distribution alone, which of course is a major component of this process, investment has to increase from $1 trillion to $2 trillion a year and be sustained over several decades. The trade alone embodied in these investments will amount to several $100 billion per year, with knock-on effects for supply chains and for markets. So it's a vast enterprise, and trade is going to have to function well to achieve this efficiently. It's important that we eliminate barriers to trade, for instance, through the Environmental Goods Agreement and as it evolves, and prevent new ones from slowing this need to promote more efficient change. So right now, as Noreen pointed out in December, we have deliberations here, but also in Geneva. The Environmental Goods Agreement aims to lower tariffs on a variety of environmentally friendly goods, but does not at this time address environmental services. And most of these goods operate in the context of an entire system, so services will be highly important going forward. And because it's about customs and trade, it's list-based. Here are the elements that are now exempt or have lower tariffs. It's an important distinction. In climate, we're looking at independent, nationally determined contributions, which will establish what I call a mosaic world of fragmented national policies, which does result in issues in competition, and a process to enhance ambition going forward. As Noreen already said, we need to encourage innovation and technology development. And this gives rise to a set of challenges. Competitiveness issues that affect not only industry, but labor, which is very important politically, trade and investment. We're going to have to mainstream this exercise. Kyoto might have been about a subset of technologies, but to get to low carbon, it's really the entire economy that has to transform. And so at least in the area of climate, we need something that's forward-looking and evolves, and we need that in the Environmental Goods Agreement too. Not just a list today, but at least I believe a set of criteria and a process to keep evolving that list going forward so that we can get transformational change going forward. And clearly this is creating tensions and anxiety regarding the long-anticipated confrontation between trade and climate, which we hope does not occur. Some key challenges. For the developed world, there are implications for exports and imports, especially of commodities produced by domestic energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, and for labor and investment. And the issue isn't the cost relative to the cost of these goods, it's the size of the differential impact relative to the profit margin. And on commodities, that's often very small. So a small change can have a big effect in these industries. Chemicals, pulp and paper, iron, steel, cement, petrochemicals, and the petroleum industry as well. In the developing world, there are issues from the impacts from response measures in the developed world on their economies and demand for exports in terms of trade. I'm quoting from a report MIT did. Unfortunately, we have the author, one of the authors of that report in the audience, Professor Jacoby, who estimated that the wealth transfers from developed to developing countries to meet the G8 proposal of many years ago would amount to $400 billion a year by 2020 and $3 trillion a year by 2050. Huge implied transfers, a lot of them in terms of trade. If these transfers don't occur, the transformational change won't occur. How we make these occur is going to be the issue. So while the economic effects in a country like the US overall of these trade issues may be small, they can be very significant for particular nations, sectors, firms, and facilities. And they are politically important for a variety of debates, including jobs, outsourcing, investment, garbage leakage, etc. So we can't avoid these discussions. They're going to occur, and climate may be just another stick in a different debate that will be used in trying to address this issue. Very quickly, some potential remedies and their objectives: counter the competitiveness impacts, reduce carbon leakage, encourage stronger climate policy. Policies include border adjustments, they include relief for domestic industries, and lately we've had the discussion of carbon clubs. Concerns: fundamental compatibility with WTO and the potential to exacerbate trade tensions as well as trade negotiations. So that's a mixed bag in terms of industry's views and labor's views and political views on this question. I'm not going to read these, but the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol have language that basically are aligned in principle with existing trade regimes. We don't know what the outcome will be here. Institutional issues: WTO provides an established, independent, sometimes controversial framework for trade and resolution of disputes. To some, its objectives seem possibly not aligned with those in the climate negotiations, and it may be at odds with various proposals on subsidies and various types of border adjustments. The national delegations in the climate negotiations are grounded in environmental issues, not economic. And in the political milieu, they may actively seek to counter the influence of WTO. I don't think that's the right approach, but these issues in border adjustment focus on the impacts of response measures. You may recall the issues associated with the EU ETS, trying to bring in some of these issues that were countered as trade issues, measures aimed at consumption rather than production and emissions, and methodologies to determine carbon footprint. These are all in the debate going on. And in an already challenging issue today, getting to 450 CO2 equilibrium multiplies these issues. So basically, climate gives the trade community an unwelcome headache, and vice versa to some extent, and we think we need to prevent that. So how do we resolve these issues? I don't know, but let's hope we can. But these institutions are independent and supreme in their areas, and having them be in confrontation is not good, because there's no easy way to resolve the issues. IPR and WIPO, trade in the WTO, and climate in the UNFCCC. I think it's important longer term, the same nations are members of all these, to get them to align over time and evolve them into a system that will help us to confront all these issues, rather than getting them into a competition that is used to kind of promote a domestic debate that through an international process where it can't be resolved. I hope we can find that way. Noreen mentioned the Major Economies Business Forum, and we certainly believe the proper way to address trade and investment concerns is through a comprehensive approach that is consistent with existing trade emissions. As Noreen said, carrots, not sticks, and don't use carbon clubs as a way to beat this issue either. I think there's a way to use them that will be effective, but it may also be used in a way that turns it into a stick. So with that, I'll say thank you. And here are some references to some of the things I spoke about as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Brian. And you gave us a very broad overview of many institutional challenges and national concerns and some of the well-known tensions that we've experienced. But in the meantime, the business community has to continue to trade, to deploy technologies, and certainly in the UN Framework Convention, we know that this is imperative both in terms of government-to-government technology cooperation as well as commercial transactions. I'd like to call Yuko Sakainen to come forward because I think that he has a very long experience in this topic, and as director of the CTCN, he's been working very hard to get CTCN up to takeoff speed to really provide technologies in a new collaborative way and working with the private sector. Thank you, Yuka.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to address this, this event here. Maybe I should start with saying that how nice it is for, I have been 20 COPs since Japan '97, and I have never been able to come to side events as a negotiator. And now for the first time I have come, maybe I have descended down to the mortals because I'm barred from informal negotiations, and that's why I'm here. But it is also nice because finally I can start to learn something new. And something new is that what is, for example, the connection with climate and trade. I was listening very carefully what the professor was saying. Indeed, first a few sentences and information of the CTC and the Climate Technology Center and Network. This was established by the bodies, that means the parties of the convention in Cancun already 5 years ago. And it took some time to negotiate the modalities of this instrument, this center, which has been now operative for a bit more than a year. But indeed, we have something concrete what we have achieved. Over 140 countries have nominated their national designated entities on technology, which are our customer base. They are the ones who are putting their questions and requests to us to be responded to. And indeed, over 40 countries have placed a request to us. There are over 50 requests we are now dealing with, and we are already implementing some 20 of those technical assistance requests. We also have surpassed a milestone of more than 100 international and national and regional institutions who have joined us as a CTCN in our network of institutions. These institutions we are going to use in responding to developing country technology requests and needs, and also giving capacity. And finally, we have managed to start up developing a climate technology library where we envisage that all those who would wish to display their technologies which are ready to be transferred to developing countries for climate purposes can be displayed through the CTC and knowledge management system. We are looking for the year 2016 be very active by receiving some more than 100 requests from developing countries and enhance their technology actions. When we come back to the issue here, technology mechanism or climate technology and trade, it's a bit tricky issue. I have been there so many years negotiating technology. I have been a member of Technology Executive Committee and also the predecessor Executive Group on Technology Transfer. When we have taken trade up in the negotiation, it usually have divided countries, and it's not an easy subject to negotiate on that level. And I have personally, when I'm coming from a Nordic country in the European Union, I have always been a bit hesitant to get into the situation where the trade negotiators would come all the way from Geneva to kind of advise the climate community, because that means that the hard trade negotiations might enter into an already very complicated negotiation realms here. But indeed, the connection is important, and we have to acknowledge the relations between these two big issues and concepts. Now, CTCN is comfortably serving the countries on their request. So we are totally country-driven system, and that means that we will serve and give the best technological and technical advice, whatever we can get if the country so wishes. And we don't kind of at the outset advise the countries on policies or political issues or regulations. But if the country would like to get advice from the CTCN on policy issues, on regulations, on making a law, or analyzing their legal systems, we are happy to provide that assistance from our expert institutions. Also, if the country is having any issue, any case on related to intellectual property rights, for example, that how to deal with them, how to enhance the country's readiness on these issues, we are happy to look whether our network institutions could be helpful. And I would mention that, for example, World Intellectual Property Organization is one of the network members of the CTCN. Now, another point is that we all acknowledge that the main driver and the main actor in the transfer and development of technologies is the business sector. It's the private sector and it's the trade. So all those kind of policies and strategies which would support the transfer and development of technologies in developing countries are of course a positive impact to our common cause to fight the climate change. And we as a CTCN, we stand ready to support those countries who wish to enhance the policies and enabling conditions for technology transfer. There actually already have been, among those 60 requests which we have received, some countries wished us to indeed develop together a businesses on climate technologies. And these are not only mitigation, this is only adaptation. So we are already engaged with countries like Mali, for example, a developing entrepreneurship on agricultural technologies and agricultural production, which entails, of course, the business and trade later on. So we are very happy if any of those requests would arrive to our center. And finally, may I say that this kind of building up an operative technology mechanism under the convention, and especially that mechanism being supported by a large network of also private sector institutions, as we have 1/3 of the network members are from private sector, is a extremely valuable source, a new source for the whole UNFCCC system. I think after 20 years of negotiations among only governments, actually, now it's the time to engage that huge source of intelligence and experience and practicality which the private sector and also, of course, research and development institutions have. And that's, I'm very happy to be one of those in these bodies which can receive this kind of support from. And we are continuing engaging our network members very actively next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jukka. And I really want to reinforce that the CTCN has been a very important catalyst in the UN Framework Convention process. It's working in new ways to advance technology advice and cooperation in partnership with business. So even if it's not always making the front page, we do see that within the UN Framework Convention, new and innovative ways to get cleaner technology widely deployed in partnership with the private sector is coming forward. So building on that, we also are very well aware that new thinking is coming forward from the trade side of the community. Those of us who watch the WTO for years, decades, sometimes have the feeling that nothing is going to change. But in fact, just as here in the UN Framework Convention that's been, 21 years and then some in the works, we see new ideas and new possibilities. And I would like to call on Henry Derwent now to talk about some of the new thinking and new ideas. We understand that change has to come not just in our climate regime and in our sustainability cooperation, but also in the trade system. And Henry, I'd like to call on you to tell us a little bit about some of the recent work in the E15 on that front. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noreen. Thank you to USCIB for the invitation, and thank you to the previous speakers. This looks a pretty simple piece of technology, but let's see whether I can, whether I've got the capacity to use it. I'm afraid we're now going to go back a little bit to the dark side, because I want deliberately to sort of emphasize some of what people on the climate side of the climate trade debate probably really fear, even if they moderate exactly what they say. Because I think being clear what you fear about the other person's position is the basis for any successful dialogue. And the work that Noreen has referred to a couple of times now, which is the E15 group of ICTSD, the International Commission on Trade and Sustainable Development, and the World Economic Forum. I'll come back to a bit more about that initiative a little bit later, but the work, it has been essentially about bringing people who are dyed-in-the-wool trade people and people who are dyed-in-the-wool climate people together and seeing across a table, quite a wide table, it has to be said, and seeing whether there was any way in which they could actually talk the same language or learn each other's language a little bit. And at an early stage of that, I found myself basically being asked by trade people, well, please explain to us what the problem is, because we don't really understand what it is you regard as needing to be changed in this system which we've built so painstakingly over such a long period. So what I'm saying is not really focused on environmental goods and services, though that's a really important part of the debate at the moment, or about tech and tech transfer, though that is as well, but it does touch on them a little bit. So it is a little bit pessimistic. It may be, to make a point, even a little bit aggressive, but then I'm a climate guy, and I think it's worth sort of allowing you to enter into this debate if you're not there already. Okay, so what's the basic problem? Brian was pretty clear about that, but let me just go through it in my own words. It's about, from a climate perspective, it's about fairness and competitiveness. On the whole, although we all like to convince ourselves that green ought to be more economic and more profitable and more beneficial, from the perspective of a large number of industries and a large number of governments as well, low carbon generally means something which gets the job done at a higher cost than if you didn't have to worry too much about carbon. And I think that even if you were to provide, if you remove any tariff problems associated with low carbon technology, or even introduce reasonable preferential tariffs, you'd still have a basic cost difference. And those who pay that extra cost don't, I'm afraid, generally benefit commensurately. The planet does, but we all know that what we're all engaged in here is a mega demonstration of the prisoner's dilemma, and this is one of the key places where it displays itself. And in general, people, whether companies or ultimate consumers, are not keen on paying the extra unless they're obliged. And if they're obliged to pay something extra, then people start getting very, very antsy about whether it's fair, whether in particular, if you're talking about companies, whether their competitors are getting what they believe to be a free ride, because they don't have that obligation imposed on them. And when the obligations are, just as a fact of life, imposed generally by national governments, then people start looking at whether my national government is imposing the same obligation as your national government and complaining about unfairness if that's not the case. And who's responsible for unfairness in international trade? Well, we assume it's the WTO. However, that's not to say that these arguments don't generate some pretty robust rebuttals or counter-arguments. You get in fact, there's quite a big literature which has started a few years ago from sort of saying, hey, all this stuff about free riding at a national level, it's just a myth. Show me one company which has actually moved out of, for example, the European Union and relocated elsewhere purely as a result of differences in the costs of, in particular, carbon through the EU ETS. Well, actually, people who adopted that position pretty firmly before are not quite so sure about that now. And I think it is generally understood that for some of the very carbon-intensive industries that Brian referred to, this is a real issue. You could go on to sort of say, well, that's it. You know, countries change the focus of their economies. National prosperity is not entirely tied up with exactly how your cement industry does or your aluminium industry does. Not very good if your cement or other energy-intensive industries have a lot of political clout. You can also sort of say, well, I'm afraid if we're going to make social progress on this, as so many other items of progress in the past, you've got to accept higher costs one way or the other. And in the case of climate, you have the argument, which is not absent from trade legislation, but was not present to quite such a strong extent, which is the argument of common but differentiated responsibilities. And indeed, again, referred to already by Brian in the form of Article 3.5 of the Convention, no disguised restrictions on trade from this stuff, please. However, I think it's fair to say that on the whole, while those arguments are quite robust, there still remains a deep concern among politicians that they're going to price themselves out of the market if they do too much on climate. So what does climate policy want to do about this in the trade area? Well, counterbalance the benefits that those who don't do enough about climate might get in terms of free riding in exports and imports by reducing the national costs of climate change where competitiveness is affected. Immediately, trade lawyers' hackles start rising. What, you're going to do something which benefits your own industries purely in the interest of improving their competitiveness? See you in court. The second one is encouraging uniform international costs from climate change action. Well, that's what we're all doing here. Frankly, we haven't been terribly good about it. Hopefully, what comes out of here will be better. But it's still going to be on a voluntary basis, and INDCs will do lots of things, but if they achieve uniform international costs from climate change action, I'll be surprised. And the third, of course, referred to already, is actually dealing with the problem at the border, imposing cost supplements one way or the other at the border. And once again, the response from many trade people is to say, okay, see you in court on that one. In a little bit more detail, climate policy enthusiasts want to see a favoring of low-carbon goods and services to the maximum extent allowed by the trade system and possibly beyond that, because they're not quite sure how far, if you kept within trade boundaries, trade rules' own boundaries, you would actually be able to counterbalance the economic advantage, the conventional economic advantage of just staying with cheap and familiar high carbon. Do remember that we are, from the perspective of many trade people, simply trying here to increase the cost of international transport and therefore the costs of international trade. We are trying to get ICAO and IMO, not very successfully it has to be said, to add to their costs in order to cope with the problem. But many of the people there sort of say, so you just want to make everybody's trade more expensive. And then finally, those of us who are beset with Montreal envy, as so many climate negotiators are, remember that trade sanctions were in fact used within the Montreal Protocol, and WTO didn't stop them. So why can't we play that trick again? Let me be more specific now. What actually does need to change? And this is my last substantive slide for those of you who are getting worried or bored. The most important thing that needs to change is the mutual lack of understanding, the mutual failure to grasp the other person's point of view, which I think has characterized so much of the debate between these two communities. But if I can go into a little bit more technical, for this I shall need to put my glasses on. One of the major issues that everybody who looks at GATT from a climate perspective immediately comes up with is Yeah, where does it say anything about climate here? Or where does it say anything which can reasonably be translated as relevant to an understanding that there could be exceptions from the normal GATT rules, and that's what Article 20 is about, for climate situations? The chapeau of Article 20 speaks about arbitrary or unjustifiable restrictions. Well, that sort of begs the question, who says whether it's justifiable or not? It mentions also policies or actions necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. Does that really apply to the climate? Maybe, maybe not. It refers, again, to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. Well, we're getting there, but it's still not something which you couldn't find plenty of trade lawyers able to argue against pretty strongly. Then there's like products, absolutely fundamental for the trade regime. The determination of likeness so far in WTO jurisprudence has not been made on the basis of how products are made, in other words, how much carbon went into the making of them, or what goes into the making of them more generally, and that is crucial. If you look at the things that we're talking about in the carbon and climate community to try to achieve carbon pricing or level carbon pricing, you hear talk of emissions trading systems, which really produce prices that the WTO system doesn't quite understand. Is this a tax? Is this not a tax? Or is it just some attempt to restrict trade that would otherwise happen? We talk about club rules. Oh, so we're talking about groups of, let me use the word, cartels of countries who decide to come together to make sure that people outside that club or cartel are actually hit with higher costs if they try to come inside. Oh, that sounds attractive. Or we're talking about procurement practices, so governments lead the way in going for low carbon. Really? Is that an attitude which will be supported by those who produce and try to sell other goods and services, which they maintain are just as good? Very difficult. So I won't go through the whole lot here. If you want to see not just more specificity about what climate policy thinks needs to change, and more than those examples that I put on there, then one place to go is the side event on Saturday that ICTSD and WEF are holding about the E15 initiative. But the full set of policy options and ideas will be presented at the Trade and Development Symposium, which is essentially part of the WTO Ministerial in Nairobi on the 14th and 17th of December. Well, I hope I've given you a bit of a flavour of what climate thinks the problem is, and I will turn over to Noreen to manage the aftermath.
Okay. So thank you, Henry, and thanks to all of our panelists. And although I think we might, at first glance, see what's been presented as just a very long list of hard things that need to be resolved that lead us to paralysis, I think the more positive message we have here is that many in the business community are already working to try to head off and manage and even find ways through this thicket of complexity and difficulty and resolve them, because we see it as in our interest as business, in the sort of broader common interest that we're pursuing for sustainable development and inclusive growth, to find a way for trade and climate change regimes to work together rather than at cross purposes. So I guess I'm looking at my watch. We have some time, I believe, for questions, and I'd like to open it up. I'd like to encourage you, when you do ask questions, to put your hand up. We have a roving mic, to identify yourself, and to try to ask a kind of a shorter question so we can get in as many as possible. And could you direct your question at a particular panelist? So please, the floor is open.
And also, I noticed several of you watching online. I'm tracking you on our homepage, so be sure to hashtag AskUSCenter so that you can join the conversation as well. Hands. Who has a question? Okay.
Hi. Near the end there, you brought up sort of needing to bridge the gap between the sort of trade community and the climate community. What kind of education could sort of cross-pollinate those two groups, and how do we begin that conversation?
And could you just identify yourself, please?
Ann Hunter-Pirtle with EPA.
Okay, that's a great question, and I think that's been an ongoing challenge. I would say that one way to do it is to try to bring more debates forward, more dialogue opportunities forward, both in the UN Framework Convention and in some of the more trade-oriented spaces. And we've already seen that happening over the course of this past year. We've seen many discussions involving both business and government representatives, including the business dialogue of the government of France, which talked about a number of issues, including some of these issues. And really, we think that demonstrates the value of having these kinds of conversations in a more recognized and acknowledged way. I would invite other panelists if they have answers or further suggestions. Brian.
Well, just a quick comment. I mean, I think those discussions really have begun. And I think they've actually been going on for quite some time. And I think things like what Henry showed are indicating the depth they're beginning to get to. And I'll just further echo, I mean, from a business perspective, in a multinational company, you don't get to choose. You've got WTO, you've got WIPO, you've got the UNFCCC and others, and if they're in conflict, you're stuck. And I think people in the business community recognize that. So to me, I mean, it isn't a question of can we get the UNFCCC to do it right or can we get the WTO to do it right. They've both got to evolve in a way that recognizes one another. I don't know what the answer is, but I really do think the discussion has begun, but it hasn't reached a framework in which it'll be resolved.
I'd just like to pick up your use of the word education, because I think that's actually a very important part of the overall response. And I mean literally education, that is to say making sure that the new generation of people who come into both of these professions, because I guess that's what you can call both of them now, are actually equipped to deal with these issues rather than simply think, oh, we do this and those people out there are trying to stop us. And I think this is part of a sort of multi-decadal change to sort of understanding the true cost of the externalities that various aspects of human activity impose and finding an acceptable way of dealing with them without actually sort of destroying the objectives, usually economic objectives, that we're trying to achieve. So it's parallel a little bit to people in business learning that actually their job in terms of being prepared for business activity in the future doesn't begin and end with the creation and defense of shareholder value. It's about dealing with the fact that, yes, there's regulation, but also there are responsibilities and there are investors' concerns and stakeholders' concerns about this stuff too. And I think those who come through the sort of trade education process and indeed through the climate education process need to understand the need to develop one's comprehension of and ability to surmount the barriers here.
Look, this is a beautiful question. I have been thinking about this very long. You know, it looks like a mission impossible. Because what comes to trade, the trade people don't negotiate like we negotiate in environment. They come with the hardest possible ammunition they have got, and then they shoot, and then we are dead. And that was when I was negotiating Montreal Protocol some 16 years ago, when indeed we came into the near to the trade rules of one environment regime. I was really shot down by the trade guys when they came and found that the environment regime is all messing Geneva. Now, but also the climate convention is wicked. This negotiation is wicked because planet is not negotiating. Planet is there and it will be destroyed by us. And that's why it can't negotiate. So we have two absolute kind of regimes which have to be put together. Really a kind of mission impossible. Now, anyhow, stopping positive note here. We are now, after Paris, we are getting into implementation. I think that the kind of debate and divide between the people and countries and so on will maybe submerge now into, because we have to start act. And this practical implementation brings practical solutions on the table. And then there will be some sense in this. Know that in the climate we have never been able to talk even about sectors. sectoral means and tools of roadmaps on technology, not coal, not oil, not gas, not HFCs, and so on, because we have been so much occupied by political debate. I think now it's the time to go into practice, and then we will sort out these problems also.
Additional questions? Great. Let's take two.
Okay. My name is Hassan. I am from Somalia. I am wondering to ask you that we are so suffering as a woman and children in the climate change and so other problems. Since you are a business in America, what's your strategic plan? Climate and security, climate and livelihood.
Thank you. And we'll just take one more and take them both together. I saw a hand back here. Where was this one? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Onduri Machulo Fred. I'm the vice chair of the CTCN Advisory Board and also a long-term negotiator, and I'm still a negotiator, unlike the director who is now outside the negotiation and is engaged in actual implementation. Yeah, in the negotiation, we are faced with so many questions about the issue of IPR and its effect on the implementation of the provisions of the convention. And there have been debate as to whether IPR is a factor in access to the environmentally sound technology. I would like a confirmation of this sort of either allegation or if it is a fact, and to what extent can we adjust the IPR to become an incentive to addressing the adverse effects of technology. Climate change. Thank you.
Okay, so two questions there. One very specific on IPR and one more directly to the needs of people on the ground.
Well, let me try to start. They're both very broad questions. I think to the first question, I think the U.S. business community is very strongly dedicated to advancing progress on climate change, both on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also on contributing to adaptation and resilience. And those are both critically important to the least developed countries, to developing countries. I mean, this is part of a common challenge that we share as part of the global community, not just from a commercial standpoint, obviously, but also because we're part of global society. And I think we've seen that evidence over many years, but especially in this very active year, 2015, as we've gotten closer and closer to COP-21, many examples of U.S. companies stepping up, either with the U.S. government, the American Business Act on climate change initiatives that we've seen, efforts of U.S. companies in many announcements of initiatives at the United Nations, in New York, and all kinds of sectoral initiatives and new announcements even here in COP21. So I think that the U.S. business community sees this as one of their highest priorities. Certainly for my organization, USCIB, we have worked very hard, and as long as I've been there, this has been one of the most important issues of our business community. I would also say that in New York, as part of the discussions of the 2030 Development Agenda, you saw there too a very strongly engaged U.S. business and international business sector working with governments, working with civil society to try to develop the Sustainable Development Goals, which include goals on energy security, poverty eradication, and of course climate change, as well as inclusive growth. And we really see that sort of broad and integrated global system as something that belongs to us because we helped to build it. And it really is something in which we provide a tremendous resources and opportunity for the future of our business, as well as in terms of the contribution we make to global society. On intellectual property right protection, And to the second question, we would say that certainly innovation and the deployment of innovative technologies depends on a variety of enabling frameworks. And this has been a topic that has been discussed for many years in the UN Framework Convention. And we feel that there's a misperception or a misunderstanding about the extent to which the existence of intellectual property rights either contributes to extra cost or presents a barrier to access to technologies. In our view, it's quite the opposite, and that strong intellectual property right protection actually creates the necessary conditions both for new technologies to come forward as well as for them to be commercialized. We think that this conversation needs to continue. It's been going on for some time in the UNFCCC, including in the predecessors of the technology mechanism as well as the technology mechanism itself. It's something in which business is happy to continue to have discussions and talk about, specific examples where governments might be encountering some barriers that we can talk about. But in general, we feel that the appropriate place to have the discussion is in forums that have the specific capacity and know-how, and that is in WIPO and in other forums. So we're happy to look for ways to provide enabling frameworks, to provide access to technologies, but it doesn't seem to us that actually IP protection is the specific barrier, and that there are others that are much more pressing that we need to work on. Does anyone else have comments? Okay.
Just shortly, very good questions on the issue of how, for example, how the CTCN can also fulfill the basic needs of the people in developing countries. We very often rely our work and found it in the technology need assessment process, which has been going on 10 years with all the countries. I think there are 80 countries involved, and there the technology, climate technology needs are actually assessed in a kind of multidisciplinary process, very bottom-up process. It takes about 2 years to find out that what the people in that country really see as a critical climate technologies they need to develop and transfer, and we hope that that process, which is really nationally owned, will bring us those national priorities, which then, of course, as a CTC, and we would hope that they are very well embedded in the sustainable development agenda of that country. That means filling the basic needs of the people and population. And if you had asked something about, gender, I want to emphasize that we are a UN organization and we follow all that kind of guidelines which we have developed for specifying genders when we talk about climate technologies. We need to know who are developing these technologies, which sections of the population, and also who are enjoying of those technologies and who are impacted of the technology use. And that means that we have to segregate women and men in these groups, otherwise we might make some mistakes here. So we are very sensitive on this issue. On Fred Onduri's question on IPR, I just want to inform that if that kind of case would come to us as a CTC, and we will deal it, that whether a country has a problem of intellectual property rights, whether they would like to develop their own intellectual property rights system, or whether they see that it is a barrier, we are ready to work case by case with our expert institutions.
Great. Okay, let's take one more round of questions. We have time for, I think we'll take 2 and give them to the panelists. So we need our 2 final brave souls to ask their questions. Silence reigns. One last chance. Any final questions? Okay, we'll take 1.
Hi, my name is Cleopatra from Channel 4 News and also from Kenya. My question is with regards to the conference in Nairobi. What do you hope will be the outcome of this?
Well, I think that we know that there are challenges in the conference in Nairobi. I'm not sure that we're really in a position to speak specifically to that, but we certainly would like to see a successful outcome there. Sorry.
I'm not really going to be able to go much further than that either. As I said, I'm a climate guy, and all we can hope for, I think, on the basis of my limited understanding, is a greater recognition of what is now a fact emerging in front of us, which is the appearance of regional trade agreements to a far, far greater extent than was ever really intended. And I think it's a shame in many ways if that's actually the way that both progressive climate trade issues get taken forward rather than a comprehensive. It's a little bit like what you see here. You know, it looks like a second best solution. But if that's the way that you actually manage to get, in particular, movement on environmental goods and services and other aspects of the Doha round, then let it be, because we can't. Neither climate nor trade can afford to be just stuck going nowhere for year after year after year.
Great. Okay, let's go ahead and close. Thank you to our online audience for joining us. We really appreciate it and hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Thanks to all of you, and let's give a round of applause